the room will smell like toast as we go. And expect we're going to do some primary sources today. Let's open in prayer, and then I'm going to let that side of the room go first because they're closest to the toaster. Cool? All right, let's begin. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. That side of the room, go make yourself some toast. We're going to need somebody to be brave and go toast first. There you go. There you go. Carpe panem. Seize the bread. We have two objectives. I think that's right. Panem, right? I took Latin 1, but it's been a while ago. Yeah. I think so. I don't know what toast is. We have two objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to do these two things. If by the end of class you cannot do these two things, then I have failed you as a teacher. I'll do my best. Please do your best. Would somebody like to read objective number 1? Thank you, James.
Explain why the city was a central element for the progressive movement in the United States.
Yes. So we began kind of this unit, this period, with a different kind of political social movement called progressivism. In our last unit, we talked about the rise of populism, which was an economic and social reform movement that began in the farms. Progressivism is a related but distinctly different economic and social reform system, but this one's very urban focused. Its goals are different than the populists. It's carried out differently than the populists. And we'll talk about how that movement kind of emerges out of the cities and becomes kind of the voice. The progressives did both two things. They basically failed at most of their long-term goals, but also succeeded wildly beyond what they could imagine. We'll kind of see how that goes through the context of this unit and the next. Would somebody like to read number 2, please? Thank you, Luke.
Assess the ways in which the labor and the women's movements challenged 19th century notions of American freedom.
Yes, some classic phonerism right here. We're going to talk about how some labor and women's movements, or kind of how some pieces that were not part of the predominant power-holding society challenged what sort of was that power-holding society and the notions of American freedom. So, when you go home tonight and your parents say, "What did you learn in school today?" you don't have to look at them and say, "Nothing," like you've been saying since you were 8. Instead, you could say, "Well, Mother, well, Father, shall we explain why the city was a central element for the progressive movement in the United States?" And they'll say, "Why, yes, child, that'll make a thrilling dinnertime conversation. You'll have something to talk about. How exciting will that be? Huh?" So thrilling, exciting. It's the best indeed. Have you done this yet, Vivian? Have you gone home and said, "Well, you should try it. You should try it."
I did it one time, and that was political slavery. When you said no, that was a good experiment.
Yeah, right.
They said yes, they would love to have that.
Well, but the Klazinskis are full of surprises. How about that? Okay. Good. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. This looks like the photographic version of the George Bellows scene, doesn't it? Okay. When we knock on the door here of the 20th century, and specifically, period 7 begins in 1890. Dr. Foner didn't lay out his book, exactly according to the College Board plan. So he sort of bounces around in this about 20-year period of 1885 to 1905, kind of like back and forth pretty readily, which in reality is how we all live our lives. We don't think like, well, today is 2020. I've stopped doing everything I did in 2019, and I'm only a 2020 person now, right? Like we all kind of phase into stuff. That's kind of the way that just humanity works. Did you guys get enough butter on that? You don't look like you just mildly threaten yours with butter? You got butter. That's good. No sunflower seeds? Huh. Okay. It's semi-Kansas toast. It's Arkansas toast. some meth on it or something. All right. But basically, for the last time in American history, wash it down with some moonshine. The economy grew as both farms and cities grew at the same time. Farming entered what would be later remembered as its last golden age, and pretty much the last time that farming would be the romanticized ideal of American life. But it was the city that really became the focus, specifically the focus of progressive politics and a new mass consumer society. New York becomes the exemplar and the vision of urban politics pretty much from here on out. By 1910, New York had 4.7 million residents, and it was the symbol of modern society, which I would argue it still holds. When people think of like, what do cities look like in America? Even if you've never been to New York, that becomes your default image, what you've seen in, television or whatever. It's like that becomes what you think of as cities. There are 4 slots over there on the toaster, so if anybody else wants it, we'll start this side of the room. Self-servicing. Otherwise, just go get yourself some whenever. Okay? Kansas toast is awesome. I recommend it. Okay. There's lots of toasters over there. Okay. In cities, in particularly New York, because that's sort of our model, but in cities you have these sharp divisions between rich and poor. You've got the arriving immigrants with maybe nothing or not much, far from nothing, and they're living in places that don't have electricity. They don't have sometimes indoor toilets. You've got 4.7 million residents living in a city, and a lot of them have to go down the street to go to the latrine, living in apartment buildings without a way to even make a potty in there, right? But you've got, not far from it, you've got what became known as Millionaires Row on Fifth Avenue, which had palatial mansions right in the middle of the city. Subpoint B. By the year 1900, basically every major city had at least one art gallery. Let's talk about our own city. Kansas City in the year 1900 was not a major city, but it wasn't kind of the backwater that Kansas Cityans assume that their city always is. It's good, isn't it? The more you toast it, the better. It looks like, Kean, looks like you just mildly annoyed your bread there. It doesn't look...
It was on 4.
Yeah. I don't know either. It's an operator error. Okay, but it is good, isn't it? It's like all these parts, they're so magical. Wheat is from Kansas. We have cows in Kansas that can make butter. Our state insect is the honeybee. Sunflower seeds. It's like so beautifully Kansas. I do too. It's my favorite state. Okay, Kansas City was not a huge city in 1900, but it wasn't totally the backwater that we might think of it. But it didn't have a major art gallery until 1915, when the founder of the Kansas City Star, William Rockwell Nelson, died and left his estate to the city to go start an art gallery. About the same time, some other rich person named Mary Atkins died. She also left her estate. They combined it together to open the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, which I will argue and continue to argue is one of the finest art museums in America. It's so good, guys. You go there when you're in like 5th grade and you never go back, and it's a shame because it's terrific. I married an artist. My wife has a fine arts degree. We go visit art galleries when we travel cities. I've been to art galleries in every city I've been to. The Nelson is so good. It's as good as anybody. It's the best in the Midwest, not including the Chicago Institute of Art, which is awesome. But like outside of Chicago Institute, Nelson Atkins is terrific. Okay, while the 19th century artists had what became known as the Hudson River School, these famous romanticized landscapes of art, a new ashcan school would show the gritty elements. So this painting, John Sloan, it's still a bit impressionist, but it's an urban scene. We're not having beautiful mountains and waterfalls. You don't imagine the prairies and the rivers. This is like pavement and iron and light bulbs, and it's a it's very much like the ashcan school. It's not about the beauty of nature. It's a gritty, no frill styles of art. I mean, this looks like it's even raining out there. That shows the urban living that people actually live in. This is what they can relate to because it's what they actually see. European abstract art was also emerging about the same time, although people also think that a lot of the modern abstractionist is hard to wrap your head around. That's still sort of a critique that modern art carries. We'll get closer to it when we get there. A lot of art galleries became so common in major cities that they referred to as the poor man's university, that even if you weren't cultured or had been to college, you could still go appreciate art. You could see the stuff that had been reserved to the rich palaces of the upper crust were now accessible to everybody. You go into the Nelson, it's free. They don't even charge you an admission. Poor people can go there as well as rich people. Who's going to Rome in here? You going to Rome? So, did you? Okay, so the Borghese that has all of those Caravaggios, there's a great Caravaggio at the Nelson. It's the masterpiece of the museum. It's up in the European galleries. It's John the Baptist. It's great, so it's good. If you go wet your whistle for a little Caravaggio in Kansas City, it's awesome. Okay, where are we at? Subpoint C. A new generation of journalists began writing for national circulation or mass circulation national magazines. So printing and distribution has sort of caught up with the demand for information. And a new style of journalist develops called the muckraker. It's a great word, muckrakers. You might know it from pre-AP, but muckrakers were, I think today we would call them investigative journalists. They were journalists that also kind of had an agenda. They were progressive era. They wanted to expose the dark side of power holding. And became famous for it. First person I want you to meet is this haggard-looking man named Lincoln Steffens. His book, The Shame of the Cities, was originally published as a series of essays in McClure's magazine. Magazine journalism is an interesting kind of journalism. It's current. They happen, magazines would come out weekly or monthly, but they would be long-form writing. Newspapers daily, or even in this era, twice a day. There'd be a morning paper and an afternoon paper. They're reporting news fast. Magazines were supposed to be a little bit slow. They're supposed to have investigations and spend time with them. And that's what you see develop. So Lincoln Steffens' Shame of the Cities grows up kind of as an investigation of urban politics, and then gets spun off into a book. Ida Tarbell is probably one of the two most famous of the muckrakers. Ida Tarbell began writing a series of essays also for McClure's to investigate John D. Rockefeller, the guy of Standard Oil, the guy that would use that horizontal integration to buy out all of his competitors. She began to investigate his business practices, to talk about all of the underhanded, deceitful stuff that he was accused of, and would kind of build this expose around it. Those essays also got spun off into a book called The History of Standard Oil Company, which normally, if I pick up a book called The History of Jack Donovan, it would probably sound like the
thrilling read.
Indeed. It would probably sound like I'm going to lionize and just adore Jack Donovan, right? Why else would I read a book called The History of Jack Donovan? The History of the Standard Oil Company was an expose of all of the dark sides of building business. So maybe The History of Jack Donovan is actually an expose talking about all the deceitful, underhanded stuff that Jack Donovan does to squash his enemies and to get away with it. But by far, the most influential was this steely-eyed looking man in the bottom right corner, Upton Sinclair, whose work, The Jungle, was not a piece of journalism. He would write journalism. He was a journalist. But The Jungle was fiction. And it told the story of this Lithuanian immigrant family who moved to the United States, ended up in Chicago, and kept getting exploited by the system to keep everybody down. The most famous scene is that Jurgis, the central character, goes and gets a job at a meat packing company where they take, like butchered cow. They take cows, slaughtered cows, and butcher it into steaks and hamburgers and sausage or whatever else. So it's a meat packing plant, so they call that. And he sees how disgusting and filthy that meat packing plants were. Yeah.
Didn't they like take up the rats and run around the plant, just like throw them in?
So there's a lot of legends about this, and I'm not sure where the truth is and where the legend is. But in the book The Jungle, they had the rats that are running along the little beams would sometimes fall off and just get ground in as sausage. Yeah. I've read The Jungle. The meat packing scenes are pretty. They turn your stomach. They're pretty unpleasant. The most famous scene is there's a guy, a maintenance man working on a catwalk, or I kind of forget the details. I think he's working on a catwalk over a rendering vat that's turning fat into lard. And he slips off and falls into the rendering vat, and they can't fish him out in time. So they just cook him into it and render human fat into it, and then dude just dissolves and it gets then packaged as lard. And it just grossed people out, right? There's no lard in this, don't worry about it. It's butter, it's delicious. Yeah. Upton Sinclair was a communist. He wanted to inspire an overthrow of communism, or an overthrow of capitalism to establish communism. That was his goal. He wanted to piss people off about the conditions of the urban poor and how much the worker was exploited. And if you read The Jungle, and I don't really recommend it, it's not that good of a book, but if you read The Jungle, you get this feeling like he's grinding this axe. This is the thing he wants to sell you on. I mean, it's okay. I'm not telling you not to read it. It's just not as good as, it's more important than good. It's more important than good. Anyway, it prompted the Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. That always kind of made Upton Sinclair a little mad that he didn't inspire a communist overthrow of the government. He just inspired the Meat Inspection Act. His line was, "I meant to hit America in the heart, but I hit him in the stomach." It just grossed people out. It didn't inspire the overthrow. Developments of the cities also come with it a certain amount of consumer freedom. In 1890, the first shopping center, what would be the precursor to the modern mall, or now the dying mall, opened in Cleveland in a building called the Arcade. Now, I say arcade, and my generation imagines a place where you go play video games. I say arcade and you hear maybe like Chuck E. Cheese, but an arcade is actually an architecture term for a building made out of arches. It's an arcade, right? So an arcade built out of arches. And the Arcade in Cleveland is a 5-story glass-topped building with a shopping mall, live bands, department store, kind of what becomes the model of malls. In 1865, it's kind of a throwback. That's a Civil War year. But in 1865, Marshall Field opened the first department store in Chicago. Marshall Field was a person, and then named the store after himself. Marshall Field found that while men earned the money in an American family, women spent the money in the American family. And so if a retailer wanted to go maximize their profits, they did not target the income earner. They targeted the income spender. And so the store motto of Marshall Field in Chicago was, give the lady what she wants. Make a store catered towards the female buyer, and she will buy stuff for men. You also see the development here of chain stores. Chain stores where there's a national brand in several cities. This is when it emerges. The most famous, the most successful of them was Woolworths. the F.W. Woolworth. They had what was called the 5, 10, 15-cent store. This is like the Dollar Tree of the turn of this. There's a Dollar Tree in my neighborhood that the R is burned out on, so it looks like the Dollar Tree. Feel like it has more street cred that way. Anyway, but the original Dollar Tree was Woolworth's with the 5 and 10, or the 5, 10, 15-cent store. Where there was, Woolworths in every city, or multiples in every city. In 1872, Ward's catalog launched, which would later become Montgomery Ward, which would later be out of business. But it brought goods to small towns. Sears Roebuck, now a failing department store, started out as a catalog store. If you lived on the farms, if you lived on the frontier, and you wanted anything, it was hard to get. There's just no stores out there. So if you want anything, you either need to make it or you need to have it shipped in. And Ward's and Sears were huge about this, that you could order off a catalog and it just didn't exist otherwise. They were the Amazon of their day. You needed anything, you had to get it shipped to you, put it on the back of a cart and roll it out to you. By 1865, again, it's kind of a fuzzy timeline. By the Civil War, businesses had spent $10 million as a segment in the entire country. By 1900, within the same lifetime, that went from 10 million to 95 million. And by far, the biggest spenders were the national brands, the patent medicines, soaps, and baking powders. Subpoint E. Henry Ford did not invent the car. This is kind of the popular legend we tell ourselves. Henry Ford did not invent the car. But his development of the assembly line made cars affordable. So essentially, he didn't invent the car, but he invented modern car production. Henry Ford was visiting one of those meat packing plants like they had in Chicago, the sort of the focus of the jungle, and they noticed that this big slaughtered cow was attached to a rack up top, and that rack was pulled on a chain on a pulley, and the cow would just move from station to station. And a butcher would stand there with a big knife and whack off a body part, and the next cow would come along, whack it, and he would just cut that same body part over and over again, and then the carcass of the cow would move on to the next butcher, who would cut off the next body part, and they were disassembling this cow in pieces. And Henry Ford is watching this process, and he says, what if it worked the other way around? What if instead of having one person build an entire car, we just work on one piece of the car and move it from station to station? Hi, good to see you. And so he takes what was disassembling a cow and makes it into assembling a car, and it's the modern day assembly line. It's the modern day assembly line. So he focused on standardizing the output, which lowered the prices. You could make the cars faster. He didn't invent the automobile, but he invented modern automobile construction. Ford Model T was a simple, light vehicle. There's not much to it. The wheels are made out of wood. The tires are very narrow. They are pneumatic tires. There is air in there. It's a little balloon inside of it. But the Model T was just it's simple. Even by the standards of the day, it was a simple car. There were fancier cars in the Model T. This was just kind of a straightforward, everyman's car. But kind of some of the great pieces out of it, the tires were very narrow. I mean, a whole Model T tire is like a fat bicycle tire, in terms of its width, which was really nice for people living on awful little dirt and gravel roads. Those narrow tires would just kind of zip along the back roads, and they had a good springy suspension on them, which would shake you to death, but it wouldn't rattle all the parts apart. It was a pretty clever design, and the Model T was also affordable. For the first time ever, an average family could buy a car. You could buy a Model T. It was standardized. The word was that in order to save money, there was only one color. Ford would joke about this. He would say, you could get a Model T in any color you want, as long as it's black. That's all they made were black cars. They made some other ones in the early days. They found out that black cars worked the best because you could roll them outside in the sun, and they would the paint would cure faster because it was black paint. It would absorb the heat of the sun faster. You didn't need as much drying time. You could make cars more quickly because that was a slow part of the process. So part of it, standardized, they only buy a black paint. There's no choice. You can't get any other trim package. This is the package. You get a Model T. But Ford also had a different problem, that if you're working on an assembly line making the same damn car over and over again, it is stupid boring and really tedious. And if all you do is you fasten those 5 nuts, next wheel, just do this over and over again, and you can't put your earbuds in and tune out because they won't be invented for another 100 years, and it's just like boring work. Workers would just quit. They're like, I need to do anything else in the whole world. This is awful. So workers would quit. So Ford said, well, I make it worth your time to stay. And he paid, this is, I mean, a crazy amount of money, would pay people $5 a day. I mean, that's like, that makes a huge income jump for what anybody else is making. Suddenly, if you get the boring job working for Ford, you have a sweet job that you will keep as long as you can. Ford overpaid his employees, intentionally overpaid his employees to keep them from just quitting all the time because the work was awful. But it also meant that if you worked for Ford, you could actually buy one of the cars that you were making. And so you would become like, I work for Ford, I drive a Ford. You would sort of take on this, they called it even Fordism, that people begin to think of themselves as a Ford employee. Yeah?
Do you know how much it cost, like one of the first ones?
No, I don't. I thought I did, and then somebody corrected me. I thought it was like about $1,000, but I think I was told no on that one. Yeah, get your computer out. How much did a Model T cost in 1910? Yeah.
It's like
$300? Okay.
after like they got
Kean reads the book. He doesn't watch Adam Norris videos all the time. Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So you said Ford paid his employees $5 a day.
Mhm.
What's like the average per day?
I don't know. Get out your computer. Look up the average pay for a worker in 1910.
It was like 125 or something.
Okay.
This is 66,000. That's definitely not right.
That's today. Yeah, look up 1910, not 2000. $850. Okay.
But it dropped to 360 in 1960.
Nice.
360. That's pretty good.
Yeah. Model Ts basically last forever. There's a guy on my street that has a Model T and he drives it. Now, it's not like his daily driver, but he tools it around on all the old Shawnee Day parades or whatever. He fires up his Model T and drives it down there. Shawnee residents. He's also the guy that owns the police car, the Shawnee police car number 2, the gray squad car. You ever see that in the old Shawnee Days parade? It's the guy who lives down the street from me. He's about 800 years old. That's actually the first police car, but it's painted number 2. And I asked him one time, I said, why, if this was the first squad car, does it say number 2 on it? And he kind of laughed. He says that Shawnee only had 1 squad car, but if they got in pursuit, they wanted the bad guy to think there was at least 1 more out there. So they painted it number 2. This is little mind games. It's not going to be on your test. Okay, Roman numeral number 2. Broadly speaking, we're going to run out of time. You got me monologuing. Question number 2, or Roman number 2. Broadly speaking, the progressive movement, which is our next topic, basically had 4 goals. And we might talk about the goals of the progressive movement, 4 things. Now, historians generally agree that these are the 4 things. It's not quite like if you just showed up in 1903 and you found an urban progressive and say, sir, please tell me about your 4 goals. Like, they wouldn't just rattle these things off. But historians have generally agreed that progressives wanted to protect social welfare. They wanted to make society a good society. They also wanted to focus on moral improvement. To not only be a good society, but a good society. In the ways that they were defining public morality, progressives wanted a certain moral improvement. They also wanted to create economic reform. They said this system that's allowing the John D. Rockefellers to just go get insanely crazy rich while other people still have to go down the street to go poo because their building doesn't have a bathroom in it, that demands real economic reform. Toast is up. And also to foster individual and government efficiency, kind of in the same way that people like, honestly, I think efficiency is the one that almost doesn't fit. I can see the bleeding heart of the first three, but the fourth one looks a little cold and robotic. But the more I think about it, the more I think that like people would say that efficiency is part of reform. Like progressives today would still protect social welfare, promote moral improvement, create economic reform, and then order Uber Eats to have their food brought to them because it's more efficient, right? Like I don't know how it fits, but somehow it seems to fit in my current understanding of progressivism. Worth noting, it's not a unified movement. Everybody focuses on different things. There's no single objective set. And if you were in 1903 and you asked a person who's a progressive, what are your 4 goals? They couldn't necessarily list them. So it's not everybody values each thing evenly. Okay, subpoint B. But let's talk, I think, first about the fourth piece, the efficiency. And our understanding of like a modern world and a modern efficiency begins with Frederick W. Taylor and his development of what's called scientific management. Taylor would stand on one of those Ford factory assembly lines and watch somebody build a Model T and begin thinking about all of the movements. How does the assembly line worker put the wheel on the car? And what is the most efficient way to do that? To break down tasks into simple and repetitive parts. But again, this is what leads to the boring machine-like work that people hate, but it allows the Henry Fords to shorten the workday. You don't have to work those 80-hour weeks anymore. You can make good money efficiently because the product can be made better and more quickly. Gets higher pay and shorter days. That's pretty sweet. I mean, teaching is sometimes boring. Not usually. This isn't really a boring job. But if I could trade a little dullness to go get more pay and shorter days, well, I might hear Dr. Rapp out, take a little boringness in my work. Maybe not, but it has a strong appeal to it. White-collar workers also have this. They earn higher wages than manual workers, but imagine being an accountant in a day before spreadsheets, where you actually had sheets that would spread out on your table and you're entering with a pencil a long line of figures and you add them up, not even with a calculator, but with actual math all the way down. Accounting, today I think accounting is a pretty underrated job. It's more, there's no math in accounting, it's arithmetic at best. It's more like problem solving. Accounting is so underrated. As a whole, business degrees are trash and you shouldn't get them, but accounting is worth getting. Anyway, but they also felt a certain amount of like scientific management taking away the joy of their job. Imagine Bob Cratchit sitting at his desk, adding up a long line of figures while Ebenezer Scrooge stands over him, telling him to add faster. Subpoint C. In 1893, there was a financial shock that sent some ripples to the markets. Basically, it was an economic downturn in 1893 and a bank panic that came along with it. And Americans fed up with the economic system. A lot of them became socialists. This is Upton Sinclair of the jungle. People would say, like, man, capitalism looks like a sinking ship. If there's something else out there, that I should do it. This is where we re-enter the storyline of Eugene v. Debs. We met Debs earlier. Do we remember where we met Debs earlier? I'm going to give you a clue. He was a union leader. He led the Pullman strike that defied the court order and went to jail for. Right. So he was a union leader. Not yet. He will eventually. Right. After the Pullman strike, when he was released, there was like crowds of people to cheer him as a hero. Debs becomes a full-on socialist and by 1912 is running for president. But he organizes the American Socialist Party. Today, socialism is in a bit of a resurge. It's been kind of a dead theory for a long time until kind of now, when socialism is becoming more vogue again. It is a sometimes popular idea that hasn't really reached a lot of sticking ground as a mainstream movement. We'll see. It's weird that, like, in American politics, an 80-year-old socialist, Bernie Sanders, is so exciting to people. But every now and then, all the cool kids like the 80-year-olds, right? Okay, the subpoint D. I'm getting my timelines kind of confused here. Have we met Samuel Gompers yet? We met him in our last unit, right? The founder of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. Okay. Samuel Gompers. The AFL was somewhat of a moderate union. They, in a lot of ways, you know, he would go on strike, but tried not to. Used collective bargaining to try to negotiate together. It wasn't just an our way or the highway. The AFL was somewhat of a moderate union, but you can only be a moderate union if there's somebody to the right or to the left of you. This is where we introduced the radical side of the union, known as the Industrial Workers of the World. The IWW, you will also hear them referred to as the Wobblies, and I'm not sure why. The IWW are also the Wobblies, Industrial Workers of the World. And this is a labor union that, if you're looking at the Venn diagram of socialists that want to overthrow capitalism and laborers who are interested in union reform, and you look at that Venn diagram, the strong overlap between those two circles are the Wobblies. Okay, these are the socialist-leaning radical union. Do we need? There's another bottle of honey. Is it on the second shelf or is it in that box over there? Oh, Mayday! Oh, yes! You got to just carry butter in your computer case. That's awesome. I'm so proud of you right now. Thank you. Somebody else have any, like, sneaking in any, but were you just keeping that? Just like in case there's a butter-related emergency? Or was this for today? You just walk around with a stick of butter?
You never know when you might get hungry.
That's You know the bulletproof diet where people like melt butter into their coffee and stuff? I had a friend of mine was doing that for a while. You need to increase your fat content, if whatever. And so people were just making coffee and they'd put a tablespoon of butter in it. It's not how I roll, but the people that do it swear by it. No. I may look like the kind of man that melts butter in his coffee, but I am not. All right. Samuel Gompers is in a lot of ways the moderate and I think more successful union over time. I think the AFL has borne out to be a much more successful, moderate negotiating kind of union. But the IWW, the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Workers of the World Unite kind of people. The fringe has a value in social discourse because it has passion and excitement, and the IWW had that. They're not moderate work-togethers. They're the people that will hold the line. And that's kind of the radical movement of the 1800s. Yeah. The AFL didn't reach out very well to minorities. The IWW would include black workers that the AFL would not necessarily. Subpoint E. I want to talk about some changes in feminism and development in feminism. The first person I want you to meet is Emma Goldman, who has odd glasses. And I'm not sure which one of these pictures is reversed, but she wouldn't wear the thing on either side. Somebody has flipped one of those images, and I'm not sure who did what. But Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was a Russian immigrant, comes to the United States, and becomes, I think she's got like a progressive phase and then moves towards the radical side. She was a noted anarchist and a lecturer. I got to say this about anarchism. Today, okay, anarchy, it means no government. There are people that want to overthrow all kinds of government. Today, I don't think anarchy exists as a viable political theory. People always think you need some kind of government. The closest you get today is a libertarian who thinks there should be very little government. But anarchism, at the turn of the 20th century was seen as a viable, if obscure, political philosophy. People would say like, well, maybe we should try it. You know, real anarchy's never been tried, and maybe it would work. It's kind of what the thinking was. Emma Goldman, a noted anarchist and a lecturer, would travel the country to speak at rallies. In particular, kind of one of her most exciting things that people would come out to hear her talk on was sexual freedom, access to birth control. She was very much like a libertine. She got arrested somewhere around 40 times in her speaking career, usually on obscenity charges. Some of her stuff was pretty obscene. It's also worth noting that a lot of those arrests were done in advance of her saying anything obscene, just as a way to get her off the speaking docket. And a lot of it, her political danger and her social danger overlapped, and people could use one to control the other. Well, she certainly did obscene things. A lot of her obscenity arrests were kind of just ways of silencing her in general. The next person I want you to meet, and our final topic here, man, I really got to figure out a way to end these on a little happier note. They always end so sad. Okay, the next person I want you to meet is a woman named Margaret Sanger. Now, I tread into this topic, not necessarily lightly, but counterculturally, maybe. Every American history textbook, every one. I mean, I've read dozens of them. Just about every one of, I don't know of any exceptions. I'm going to say every one. I could be wrong. Treats Margaret Sanger as a real hero. Dr. Foner will too. And I think that is the mainstream interpretation of Margaret Sanger. I think the textbooks are tragically wrong. You are welcome to form your own opinion. I'm going to let you have some intellectual freedom on this one. You're welcome to reach your own conclusion. But I'm going to present a side that no textbook seems to address, and I'm going to let Margaret Sanger do it in her own words. Margaret Sanger placed the issue of birth control at the heart of this new feminist era. In 1921, Margaret Sanger founded the American Birth Control League. The goals of the American Birth Control League were spelled out in several of her books, which I've excerpted here in your notes in long excerpts and given you the links. You can go see the whole thing yourself. You don't have to just take my excerpts. There's the whole thing's there for you. In 1920, Margaret Sanger wrote in her book, Woman in the New Race, she explained that undesirable immigrants, in particular Negroes, Indians, and Chinese, were going to overwhelm the native-born white people of America, and that the country needed a constructive way to promote what she referred to as the better races. She writes, "What material is there for a greater American race? What elements make up our present millions? Where do they live? How do they live? In what direction does our national civilization bend their ideals? What is the effect of the melting pot upon the foreigner once he begins to melt? Are we now producing a freer, juster, more intelligent, more idealistic, creative people out of the varied ingredients here?" Before we can answer these questions, among our more than 100 million population are Negroes, Indians, Chinese, and other colored people, to the number of 11 million. There are also 14.5 persons of foreign birth. Besides these, there are 14 million children of foreign-born parents, and 6.5 million persons whose fathers and mothers were born on foreign soil, making a total of 46 million people of foreign stock. 50% of our population is of the native white strain. 1/4 of all the immigrants over 14 years of age admitted during the 2 decades prior were illiterate. Of the 8.3 million who arrived in 1900, 2.2 million could not read or write. There were 1.6 million illiterate foreigners in the United States when the census was taken. Do these elements give promise of a better race? Are we doing anything to genuinely constructive to overcome this situation? This is where we turn to her book in 1922 called The Pivot of Civilization. The pivot is upon which the thing turns. This is how civilization will turn. And here she gave the specific goal of the American Birth Control League was to create a race of well-born children by limiting reckless breeding, especially among people who have genetic tendencies to crime, as if some people are just born to be criminals, mental and physical defects, and to ensure racial progress through a practice known as eugenics to sterilize feeble-minded people. If somebody is not smart enough to have children, they should be sterilized. Well, you can control the world's problems by controlling the number of problematic people. The American Birth Control League. The American Birth Control League, she writes, aims to correlate the findings of scientists, statisticians, and investigators through the fields of research, investigation, hygienic and physiological instruction, sterilization, education, legislative, organizational, and international goals. They put out a magazine called the Birth Control Review, reporting studies of the relationship between controlled and uncontrolled populations and how it relates to world problems. Today, the American Birth Control League is named Planned Parenthood, with 78% of its clinics in or within walking distance of minority neighborhoods. It provides black women with 29.7 abortions per 1,000 women, compared to 8 per 1,000 for white women. And the information there is from the government CDC. It's as if Margaret Sanger's wildest goals continue to come true.